I was raised in the Iranian embassy in Moscow during the Stalin regime in Russia. I learned about dictatorships. I learned all kinds of things. I learned about atheism. I learned about the clergy's dislike for other religions.
In early September 1939, they were on their way back from summer vacation in Berlin to Moscow. And he had seen Hitler speak. He said he was a young boy, and it was a huge crowd, but he had seen him speak. The train he was on with his mother, and the train is stopped at the border with Poland. And 2 kilometers in the distance, they can hear the bombing that signaled the beginning of World War II.
In 1941, during the Second World War, my father, mother, and myself went on a pilgrimage to Haifa, where we met Shoghi Effendi. He welcomed us, and we spent 22 days in Haifa. He would talk about the war, about the situation of the world. He talked to us about Baha'i principles, about his expectations of how these principles were going to be put into operation, and I understood what he was talking about. I developed that in that respect early in life. I started reading newspapers at the age of 8, so I was fortunate that way. Several things amazed me about Shoghi Effendi. He was so well informed, and when he spoke in complete sentences and in paragraphs. You could set it in print right there. There were no grammatical mistakes. And the clarity with which he explained Baha'i principles.
Toward the end of World War II, Firuz traveled east through Asia and on to the United States. Arriving in 1944, he enrolled at Stanford University. After graduating, he immediately began graduate studies and later received a Master of Arts degree from the same university. He continued his studies at Harvard, where he received a PhD in history. In 1956, he gained admission to the faculty at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. In 1967, he had gained the full rank of professor. His Baha'i service grew more and more over the years, from local and regional responsibilities to national committees, editorial boards, and invitations as a speaker to Baha'i educational institutions. In 1963, Firuz was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly, the faith's most senior institution in the United States, a service that would continue until his retirement in 2000.
When the civil rights movement gathered momentum, when the Vietnam War took such a bad turn, there was dissatisfaction with the American general governmental policy. There were riots against the Vietnam War. People were trying to levitate the Pentagon. Remember all of this? The hippies were active. This is when the Baha'i faith started growing. Why? Because the general dissatisfaction led people to seek new ways, and the Baha'i faith was offering solutions. And a majority of people who are Baha'is today are the result of that turmoil of Vietnam War, civil rights movement, and whatnot.
Even Firuz felt inclined to step up to the sacrifice required to promote social change. He expressed his thoughts in a letter to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States.
December 10, 1963. To the members of the NSA from F. Kazemzadeh, I would welcome any action the Baha'is of Jackson, Mississippi may feel desirable to help repeal the law prohibiting the members of one race to extend the hospitality of their homes to members of another race. To invalidate such regulations, we would have to bring them into a court of law. A Baha'i would have to be arrested, tried by a local court, appeal to a higher court, and keep going up until the federal courts find the regulation unconstitutional. I feel that such an action would do a great deal of good. I am willing to go to Jackson, stay in the home of a Negro Baha'i, be arrested, and face the music.
For instance, in civil rights, we are for the unity of races. No matter what regime comes, if a Grand Dragon of Ku Klux Klan becomes president of the United States, we still are going to proclaim the principle of race unity. But we are not going to take a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, "Don't vote for the Grand Dragon of Ku Klux Klan." And this worked well for us in those years.
Following the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, a rise in state-sponsored persecutions arose for the Baha'is of that country. The External Affairs Office was established, starting in New Haven, Connecticut, and later moving to Washington, D.C.
Well, for me, it started with a telephone call from Mildred Muttahedeh. She had been very active in external affairs under the direct guidance of Shoghi Effendi. Mildred called me and said that she had a request or an instruction from the Universal House of Justice to meet with her friend and business partner, Nelson Rockefeller, to ask him to intervene with the Shah. This is now the summer of 1979.
Together with newly established resolutions by the UN Commission on Human Rights and the UN General Assembly, the Baha'is and congressional resolutions cast a spotlight on the Iranian regime to help dissuade it from continuing the bloody program against the Iranian Baha'is. In 1998, Firuz was appointed by President Clinton as a commissioner to the newly established U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom.
I then accepted the appointment, and I had a heart attack, and I was at a hospital here, and Wilma used the appointment to announce it to me that she had a telephone call from the White House that I was appointed, and she used that to impress the staff of the hospital so I would get better treatment. Loudly she proclaimed
That's
in the
his
corridor,
version.
Firuz, you had a telephone call from the White House. You have been appointed by the president.
He became a leading advocate for religious freedom beyond the Baha'is of Iran to many other faith groups facing persecution based on their beliefs. The foundation of Firuz's efforts was his strength of character and his close adherence to principle.
You see, this is a question of basic principle. Are we going to use any means to advance our case, or we are not? Are we going to be faithful to principle? We were not going to lie. We were not going to use invention. We were guided by essential Baha'i principle. Tell the truth. If you don't know, tell people you don't know. You will find out. And this caught on with our interlocutors very quickly. They realized that they can rely on us. And in fact, they said that there was a telephone conversation with one government official with the press. And he says, the press asked, "Can we publish this?" And the government official said, if Baha'is told you, you can go to press. You can publish. Because we have never exaggerated or concealed. The Baha'i principle has to prevail. And a Baha'i who engages in this kind of activity should remember what the Baha'i principles are and live up to them.
For me, most important about his personality was the absolute total honesty. He would tell me whatever it was that he believed, it was the truth, and there was never coloring. It was what it was. And that's rare among a great number of people who want to either impress or who think they know about something. If he didn't know, he said, I don't know. And that was a big influence on me because I don't tell people now things that I don't know.
On one of his many trips to advance the protection of Baha'is, Firuz traveled to Egypt in the hope that he would be able to visit Baha'is who had been arrested in that country.
The government on every level was telling us lies. However, somehow they agreed to our delegation's request that we should meet with Baha'i prisoners who were held at the Tara prison. They took me to this prison, and the prisoners in prison garb were brought in, and all of this is being filmed. And I wanted very badly to let these prisoners know that I was a Baha'i. The prisoners were very guarded. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what the political situation was. They didn't know who was this individual. But I found a way. I put my hand demonstratively right in the middle of the conference table. And one of them looked, and he saw my Baha'i ring. And he whispered something to the next Baha'i next to me. And they all looked. And the expressions on their faces changed. That moment of recognition of us being on the same side, in the prison conditions, under strong lights, with the cameras going, I will never forget in my life.
Firuz had a lifelong effect on his students, from heads of state to those he worked with and those he encountered.
Over a period of some 35 years of teaching at Yale, I had hundreds, if not thousands, of students. I couldn't remember all of them. When I went with the commission to the White House for one of these formal meetings at which nothing much happens, except that the president speaks a few words of encouragement. Just before that meeting started, Bush came over and we shook hands, and he said, I was your student, I took your course. And I said, well, I'm very happy to hear this. And then we sat down for a presidential remarks, and before he started his remarks, he leaned over and he said, you gave me a C+. Of course, I was very happy I hadn't flunked Mr. Bush.
In 2000, I had the privilege to go with him as he visited Berlin again, because it was an opportunity to watch him as several aspects of his life and being came together in time. He wanted to find the place where he and his mother and father had stayed, and we found it. And my recollection is that in that neighborhood was the untouched, deliberately untouched ruins of a beautiful church that had been bombed during the war. And it made me realize He was this amalgamation, and he carried with him the vibrancy of the days of the Baha'is and the early days of Baha'u'llah, as well as the power that had been behind the Soviet Union and the dictatorships of the 20th century. And then, of course, all his life journeys, the permission from Shoghi Effendi to be able to emigrate from Iran. He had left the Soviet Union, gone to Iran for a few years, wanted to get his education, got permission to get it in America, traveling during World War II from Iran, getting up to California, and then his life here in this country as a professor. And eventually, of course, the work that he did at the highest levels of government. It all seemed to become captured for me in that moment, as though it all of history and all of Firuz's history came together. And he thought about his beloved parents, and he thought about his beloved ancestors, everything he had witnessed during his lifetime, everything he had been able and privileged to do for the Baha'is of Iran, service on the National Spiritual Assembly. I also, at that moment, just felt that it was a privilege, yet again, to be in the presence of this remarkable human being, unlike any other whom I've had the privilege to know.